I think we're live. If just can you give us the thumbs up or something in the chat on the right box? That would be great. Thank you for that, Alex. If you guys could let us know if you could hear us, if everything's working properly in the chat, just a thumbs up or just a hi. Narina, thank you very much, loud and clear. All right, there we go. Messages are coming through. So we are live. Fantastic. Well, let me kick this off by saying thank you very much for joining us from wherever you're joining us. If it's cold Melbourne, thanks for joining us from cold Melbourne, or anywhere else in Australia or New Zealand. Let us also know if you're not from Australia, because we've started to notice people joining from all over the world. So if you are not from ANZ region, drop us a note in the comments as well. I'd love to know. But for those of you who maybe this is the first time you're joining, I'm Shaheen from X Growth, and I'm going to be the host today for this webinar. And for again, those who don't know Growth Colony is a community of marketers and growth professionals and sales professionals where we hold events when Corona's not around, webinars, and we run our podcast on everything, mainly B2B growth and sales and marketing. So on that note, I'd like to jump right in. Today, we're talking about podcasting and why podcasting is important and how can podcasting benefit a business. Now, today I have Serpil Chanelmish. I got that right, I think, founder of Written and Recorded, and Chris Ashmore, head of podcast partnerships at Sound Cartel. So on that note, I'd love to pass the mic to you guys and do a quick intro about who you are and what you do. Let's go.
Okay, rapid fire. So
yes, thanks.
As Shaheen said, I'm Serpil. I founded Written and Recorded after 20 years across mainstream media. We're a content marketing agency specializing in professional podcast production, SEO, optimized copywriting, and communication training workshops. So that's how to write well, how to present well in public, so public presentation workshops, and how to create your own podcast series. So that's us in a nutshell. We essentially help brands be discovered by people and search engines.
Thank you very much, Serpil. Chris.
Thank you, Shaheen. Yeah, just in a nutshell, I work for a company, Sound Cartel. We've been around for 34 years, mostly producing subscription-based business audio programs. Back in the day, audio cassette, remember them? Audio CD, and today, of course, we have apps. But the last few years, of course, as podcasting has been so popular, we've morphed into producing a lot of branded podcasts for large companies and government and associations. So I'm a leading producer, and I work closely with those clients on how to get the most out of their audio strategy and their audio content.
Gotcha. For any of our Gen Z audience, we will leave a photo of a cassette in the description of the show. But let's dive right into it, and let's have a chat about podcasts, and why we're having this conversation. So, firstly, I'd like to know, Serpil, from your side, what's the buzz about podcasts? It's been around for multiple years, and it's all of a sudden starting to pick up. COVID has been a big player, but even before COVID, it started to get a lot more popular. What is the buzz around podcasts? Why podcasts all of a sudden?
I guess it's because podcasting is going more mainstream. And there's a lot of money being thrown into podcasts. So you're getting really good quality podcasts. So it's sort of an opportunity for people to act as their own publishers. So brands, the traditional media has become really disrupted. So brands can't rely on traditional media like they used to once upon a time. So it gives them an opportunity to become their own news channel, their own entertainment channel. So that's the buzz around it. The other buzz around it is that as a medium, there's a lot of technological push towards voice, and we're seeing this with investment in things like Alexa and Google Home and voice assistants and voice technology. So that is creating a buzz around the medium because there's an emphasis on voice as opposed to any other medium. And I think probably the buzz around it is that people who are prominent voices have started jumping on the bandwagon. So like the Obamas have a podcast, David Tennant, Doctor Who has a podcast. So that's sort of creating a bit of a buzz around it. And I also reckon it's because it gives people an opportunity to tap into really niche topics. So that creates a buzz around it. So instead of being spoon-fed content, which we have traditionally done, like, we've had appointment TV or we've had to listen to whatever the radio DJ fed us, now we can actually go, you know what, I'm really interested in basketball. Well, there's a podcast for you. I'm really interested in sustainability. There's a podcast for you. I'm interested in how to grow my investment portfolio. There's a podcast for you. So I think that's creating the buzz.
Or B2B marketing. There's a podcast for you called Growth Colony. Thanks for that. That makes sense. And I'd also like to get your opinion on this, Chris, considering how long you've been in this profession and specifically working with sound. There, just like Serpil mentioned, there is plenty of buzz. I mean, some argue that, Spotify is making massive moves. They just signed that contract with and his name Joe Rogan. Thank you, for $100 million. Their stock price has just jumped for a couple billion, or 1 point something billion, just because of that. And a lot of people say that in the tech war that they're facing against Amazon and Apple and Google and some of these big players, Spotify's main play is going to be to go into podcasts and become the dominant player in that space. How do you see this development over the past few years or even decades of sound and where we are today?
Yeah, but there's a huge buzz now at the moment. But if you think podcasting has really been around 20 years, and the term podcasting was coined in 2004. And that's 16 years ago. But what the biggest change is the mobile phone. It was 2014, 2015 is when Apple put that iconic purple podcast app pre-installed on all Apple iPhones, and that's generated the buzz from then. But it's taken 2 or 3 years for good quality podcast shows to go out there for people to want to come back and listen for more. I mean, from my point of view, podcasting is just another distribution channel for audio content. As I said back in the day, it was audio cassette and audio CD. And why it's happening, why it's, I suppose, more exciting now is that with the technology of mobile phones, we can listen. We don't need a portable CD player to listen to spoken word audio. It's all deliverable on streaming devices. And I don't know what the percentage is now, but it's well above 60 or 70% of all podcast consumption is on a mobile device. So that's where that's come from. And it's only going to get more important for companies to look at spoken word audio and podcasting, because as more money is funneled into it, I think I just read this morning, there's something like $50 million in advertising revenue for podcasts in Australia. So with that more money that's being funneled into it, there will be more better, higher quality shows and more of it. And that will then in turn lead to more money being pumped into it. So it's this snowball effect. So the last few years, particularly in Australia, I think ABC started their, what do they call it, audio studios in 2017. Since around that time, 2017, 2018, we have seen phenomenal growth, and that'll continue, I think.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're saying, there's $50 million in ads in Australia that is going into podcasts, and that's going to grow. But one of the terms that you hear quite often is, somebody comes in with with a new podcast. And a term that is people would say is like, here we go, here's another podcast, here's somebody else launching another podcast, right? And they're like, what's the point? Should we launch a podcast? Everybody has a podcast. Why should I launch a podcast? Is there merit to that? Is there any truth to that statement? Is the space saturated? What are your thoughts? Serpil, maybe we'll start with yourself.
Okay, so I don't think there's any value to thinking about it in terms of that. So we know that there's over 1 million podcasts at the moment. In fact, there was like something like 200,000 popped up during the pandemic, because we were under the 1 million mark prior to the pandemic. So everyone just sort of went, okay, let's create a podcast while we're in lockdown. It doesn't mean that there's merit to it if so-and-so announces that they've got a podcast, unless there's value in that podcast, unless there's a purpose to that podcast, and there's, a real sort of community built around that podcast. So I'm going to give you the example last year of a brand that launched a podcast. So Airwick launched a podcast last year, right? And they made, they got so much media coverage, so much attention around it all over the world. And it was around, so Airwick does a toilet freshener product, and so it was called the VIP podcast, and they had a creative sort of approach to it. They had the host recording in a toilet cubicle, and the guests would be in the next door toilet cubicle, so kind of humorous, on brand, right? And then the topics looked at things like how not to stink at dating, how not to stink at making balloon animals. Here's the thing, though, they only delivered 3 episodes. So you have to question, what is the value of that for the audience? What are you trying to do other than a PR stunt? So I think you can say Airwick's got a podcast, but so what if at the end of the day they didn't provide value to the audience? And that's what I would bring it back to. So if I was working on that campaign, I'd go, like, who's our audience? What do we know about them? What are their behaviors? What are they like? If, for instance, they're actually concerned about dating, if people who buy toilet freshener are concerned about dating, why not just make the entire podcast series about how not to stink at dating and give them tangible takeaways that they can apply to their life, something that's valuable, rather than just random disjointed topics and just capping it at 3 episodes where it just doesn't make any sense. Sure, you got PR out of it, but how did the audience feel? How did your customers feel as a result of that experience? Pretty stinky, I imagine.
Yeah. So don't be focused on, what's happening in the market, what's happening with competition. Look at ways that you could basically create stuff of value, and don't necessarily look at the saturation in the market. Is there anything that you want to add to that as well, Chris? Yeah, please go for it.
So that's very interesting from Serpil. Sounds like something that comes from an advertising agency, which is very focused on short-termism and projects that last 3 months. And podcasting really should be considered something that's long-term, a long-term marketing strategy. There's, as Serpil was saying, there's over 1 million podcasts today. I think there's 1.1 million. And in that month of May, there were an added 96,500 podcasts on Apple Podcasts. 3 years ago, they were getting about 8,000 a month. So you can see the huge growth the last couple of months. Interestingly, it's been reported that about 75% of all podcasts on Apple Podcasts no longer are running, meaning there's no more extra episodes. So of that million, only 250,000 are still going. So there's what's called, I think for a lot of companies, a lot of people, they get so excited to do it, and then they realize that it's actually a bit of hard work to continue to do something at high quality. And perhaps they haven't thought about what their strategy is in the beginning before they started it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And there's the statistics of like, so what, 70%, 60% of podcasts only do they don't go past the 7th episode or the 8th episode. Is that the number? I'm not sure about the exact number.
Eight is the average lifetime of a podcast. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And can I just jump in and just add to that, that while you need a consistent long-term strategy, like Chris said, a podcast don't need to go on forever either. So when you get to that point where you feel like you're scrambling for topic ideas, or you feel like, in industry speak, we would say padding, you just need to pull the plug on that. And it's a bit like our favorite TV series, right? They don't go on forever. There's a lifespan of every single content that you create. When you've naturally reached that lifespan, you need to make the hard decision and go, we're not getting the engagement, or we're not delivering the value that we set out to deliver with this podcast anymore. The brand can create a brand new podcast, just don't continue with the existing one.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Chris, what are some of the reasons that businesses go and start a podcast? Like have you seen some of the initial reasoning and the core element that they say, you know what, let's build a podcast? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, there's many different reasons, of course, but one is that there's an engagement with an audience when it comes to audio content. If you think about other forms of media, people consume media in different ways and for different reasons. So you have blogs that serve a purpose, and newsletters, and books, magazines, and then you've got videos, which tend to be shorter. They might be a couple of minutes, and you might see them on social media. They jump out at you. So there's a certain message that you need to convey in these different media. Podcasting is different in the sense that you can dive deeply into a subject. This is a statistic from Acast, a podcast platform, where 80% of people who seek out a podcast do so for self-education, self-knowledge. And for businesses, it's something that you've got information that you can share with an audience. Say if you're a law firm or an accounting firm, and particularly in this day and age with COVID-19, say you're an accounting firm that is targeting small business owners, what is it that you know that you can share with that group of people who are want to know what does JobKeeper mean for them? So there are people searching for audio content that is long form, 20 or 30-minute episodes that they can listen to on their commute or walking around the block or whatever they do. And you have the opportunity as a business to share that knowledge. And when you share it, then your target market will feel good about you. It's a gift that you're giving to your market. They'll, over a long term, hopefully, when they're ready to engage with an accountant, for an example, they might go to you because they know you, they like you, they trust you, that old sales premise. So that's one of the good things about podcasting. The other thing is that they hear from you directly. You don't really get that from a blog or a newsletter. They hear your voice. They get to know your personality, who you're like. So long as you're likable and you're interesting and engaging, they will continue to listen to further episodes of what you produce.
Right. So there's that element of humanizing the company and the organization, but also the element of brand building. And being top of mind. Is there anything else other than these two, Serpil, that comes to mind from your side and you like to add?
So I guess it comes down to what Chris was saying in terms of you're getting to spend a lot of time with your customers, unlike any other medium. So if you think about something like video, you're usually spending 1 to 3 minutes on video with a customer. That's generally what the video length hovers around. Whereas with a podcast, they tend to be anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour, depending on what the content is. So that's a hell of a lot of time that you are in a customer's ears, reinforcing that relationship and building that sort of loyalty, that brand. It's reinforcing that brand influence and awareness. But also the beauty of the medium is that you can literally follow your customers anywhere they are. So you can follow your customers while they're washing their dishes, while they're gardening, while they're on the loo. Like, you can literally be their continuous companion and be the person that sort of holds their hand throughout their day. Just be there shadowing them all the time and giving them valuable content. And not a lot of mediums. In fact, it is the only medium that is able to do that. So that is a massive strength.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you mentioned earlier was, do you think there's saturation? So if we compare it to something like, I don't know, if, like Facebook business pages, where there's about 80 million of them compared to 1 million podcasts. So saturation is really quite low when you compare it to something like that. And then the other thing that we know is that it's an untapped opportunity. So only about 3% of marketers are using it. So it's kind of like the dark horse of content marketing. If you carve out a niche for yourself that no one's talking about, you've got the audience hooked.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think even for us, that was one of the things when we kind of decided to do our podcast, where we noticed that there isn't much in our space for the Australian market, and we kind of came up with that with the B2B podcast. I'm going to stop promoting our podcast. I'm sorry. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to squeeze a couple in later on, but let's say I'm convinced that, you know what, we should build our brand through podcasting and be present with our customer at different stages that they're in, so that we can establish that human connection. Serpil, where should I start? Where, I'm convinced. All right, we got to do a podcast. Where do I start now?
Okay, first of all, you start by not making it about you, by making it about the audience. You need to put the audience at the heart of the podcast process. If you make it about your product or service, you're gonna fail. It's not going to create that heart connection that Chris was talking about. So you can't use it as a sales vehicle. You can have soft touch branding mentions throughout the podcast. But I listened to a podcast the other day, for instance, where the guy spent the first 7 minutes, I am not kidding you, I timed him, doing a hard sell. And you're probably wondering, well, why did you persevere? I just like road testing podcasts to see what people are doing out there. And then he spent probably another 4 minutes rattling off the bio of the person he was going to interview before he even got into the guts of it. So do not do a hard sell, and think about who's my audience? What problem am I trying to solve for them? What pains do they have that I can help them with? So that's the very first thing that you need to do before you actually commit to the podcast process. If you can't, so I always say people need an emotional reason to invest in your brand, to invest in your product, in your podcast. So if you don't give them that emotional reason to invest in you, then they're not going to commit to it. And in terms of, like, it sounds really simple, like the introduction of a podcast is crucial. This is a mistake that people make, where they don't tell you what they're going to deliver you in that podcast. So you need to tell them from the get-go what they're committing to. So for the next half an hour, what should I expect from this podcast? You've literally got seconds to hook them in. And if you don't hook them in straight away and tell them what you're going to deliver them in the podcast and convince them that they should continue to listen, they'll just, there's a million others to choose from. They'll just switch off and go to another one. So you need to use clever devices that hook someone in. So that might be, like an example, it might be using a grab. So a grab's a term that we use where, you might cut 20 or 30 seconds of what the guest is going to say later in the podcast as a tease of this is what's coming up. Or you could create really clever narration, like you might say something like, when Bill Granger turned 60, he, sat down and cried uncontrollably for the next 3 hours. In today's episode, we're going to discuss why milestones, birthdays are a turning point for most of us. Immediately, okay, that's what this episode's about. I'm in. But if you don't tell people that and you spend time selling and rambling and meandering, you've just lost an opportunity to. So that there's some of the key things that I hear people doing that are easy mistakes.
Gotcha. And I want to definitely come back to mistakes for sure, and dig a little bit deeper into that. But you're absolutely right. You gotta have a hook that people would listen and say, you know what, I'm willing to give you another 10 seconds before I turn off this podcast, or another 20 seconds. But I want to, Chris, what would you say it's after that, right? So I've figured out what I'm doing for what audience I'm going after, and I've worked a little bit on how I would like to start a podcast. What other things do I need to take into consideration when I'm going to start? What are those bits and pieces?
Can I go back?
Go back. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
I don't know if we're going to talk about podcast strategy later, but I'd say the first thing, and this is going to sound like a commercial, and I don't mean it to, but I generally think if you're thinking as a business of perhaps going into podcasting, maybe engage with someone who has done it before, knows what they're doing, and not necessarily me or Serpil or perhaps Serpil, but just learning a bit. There's a lot to take in consideration. I think the very first thing, I think that maybe what you said is, as Serpil was saying, I'd say that why is the first question to ask. Why are you doing a podcast? And that means, how does that reflect your business goals? So a lot of businesses, and this is great, that they want to increase their market awareness. So you might be a startup and you want to get national exposure. Well, the good thing about podcasts is that it doesn't limit you to a geography, just like with anything online, really. You want to get awareness around the country. So that perhaps is your goal. Okay, you might be an app developer and you want to get people all around the country to use your app. The next thing is then it's the who. Who is your audience? So you have to really understand who your audience is. And Serpil touched upon this, and it could be a demographic of between 18 and 35 years old. So what are they interested in? What do they want to know about? What do they want to learn? And it's that intersection of the why, your business goals, and the who, your target market or your audience. That intersection will dictate the what. So what is your podcast going to be about? So an example, I suppose, is there's a company in Perth called Rate It. The CEO is a bloke called Michael Momsen, and he started this company, I think 5 or 6 years ago. I'm not quite sure, but basically, I don't know if you've seen these iPads as you go out of a store in Maya, or we've got one at the local library that asks you to rate your experience in that store. So you would touch, these days with COVID-19, you might not want to touch it, but you would touch the emoji that reflects your experience. So a happy face or not so happy. And they would collate that data. And so, that's where their business comes from. So what they have done is they made a podcast that is aimed at the customer experience manager of these big retail companies. And the podcast is about, so that's their audience. That's why they're doing it. They want to get exposure to these people. So the content is interviews with world leaders in customer experience. So one episode, the CEO was talking with the customer experience leader or manager at Disney, which is world famous for their customer experience, and many other different types. And the listenership for this podcast just went through the roof. And even today, if you go into Apple Podcast and you type in just the first 3 letters, CUS, their podcast is called Customer Experience Leaders, straight away it comes up as number 1. So they own the market in customer experience. So it comes down to why you're doing it, who your audience is, and then that dictates the what. And that's the first start. And that could take quite a while to get your head around. So don't come into saying, oh, we should just do a podcast. You really got to think about strategically why you're doing it.
Gotcha. Let's talk about, we touched on this a little bit, a circle we spoke about a bit in terms of some of the mistakes that people make, right?
Yeah.
And I'd love to get both of your opinion on if there's anything else that comes to mind, because Circle, you mentioned that sometimes the why is a bit vague. You mentioned one of the problems that people don't have a hook at the beginning. I know when we started the podcast, right, all of a sudden I had like 6 podcast recordings per week. Like, we didn't plan for that. My schedule was just podcasts. Like, all of a sudden it was like this podcast with this person, because we got excited and we're like, do you want to do a podcast? And we had a network of people that were suitable for doing podcasts, CMOs and marketing directors and so on and so forth. But we kind of went overboard all of a sudden. We're like, do you want to do a podcast? Do you want to do a podcast? A podcast for you, a podcast for you, right? And like, total burnout. But I'd love to hear, what are some of the other mistakes that you see people make when they're just about to embark on doing their podcast? And Chris, the other one that you mentioned was, get a professional, get someone who's done it before, because it's going to save you a lot of time. Is there anything else from both of you that comes to mind?
Yeah, so you mentioned the burnout thing. That comes back to the strategy again that Chris was talking about. So once you've worked out the strategy, then the strategy extends to a content strategy, a content plan. So you wouldn't have experienced burnout if you had actually strategically mapped out, when am I recording? What's the frequency of the podcast release? Am I going to release weekly, fortnightly, monthly? And then mapped it out as in, okay, week 1, we release this, week 2, we release this. And you also build a consistent listening pattern with your audience. Podcasts don't work so well when you're doing ad hoc releases. If you promise people that you're going to be delivering at 12 noon on a Wednesday every week, then deliver 12 noon on a Wednesday every week. Don't go, oh, oops, it didn't work this week, you have to wait till Friday. That just annoys people. Again, there's a million more they can choose to listen to. So that's a mistake people make. A mistake a lot of people make, which Chris would be very familiar with, is thinking that they can just jump in, start recording, stream of consciousness, upload it to a platform and share it with the world. You're not that profound. That's sorry to be that harsh. It's just not going to work. And it sounds really harsh of me, but nobody is that profound. It takes a lot of work behind the scenes to make a podcast sound as good as it does, the good quality ones, right? And then a lot of some of the other mistakes people make is because there's a lot of talk around how podcasts need to be authentic and real and show the real personality of people. They kind of they show us behind the curtain, which you don't want to ever show people behind the curtain. A magician never shows you how they come up with the trick, right? Just deliver us the great trick. Don't tell us what goes on behind. We might do this later with that and edit this section out, and that's all in the podcast. That's a mistake people make. And they record really low quality audio as well, which is, I think, unforgivable considering how intimate a podcast is. And it's only one channel you're relying on. You're just relying on audio, nothing else. There's no visuals distracting you. And if the quality of the audio recording is not up to scratch, why would I want to listen to that? Why do I want to hurt my ears for half an hour? So there's, a lot of I guess the myths around podcasting come back to what Chris was saying earlier, that, it started off grassroots with, cassettes. And when people sort of started taking up podcasting, it was a really hobbyist sort of area, other than, your local dentist who used to record medical advice on a cassette tape and hand it over to you when you got your teeth cleaned. Hobbyists really sort of were in that area, and that's no longer the case. So the benchmark is set really high. So if you're not playing the big game, you might as well get out of it. Just don't waste your time trying to compete in a space where quality really matters, because unless you're a brand where your quality actually stands for cheap. And one of the examples that I like to give is in WA, there used to be a company called WA Salvage, which was a direct competitor to Bunnings years ago. And their catchphrase was, "We're not fancy, but we're cheap." So if that actually is your brand positioning statement, maybe you can get away with a cheap sounding podcast. But I would just say always focus on the quality.
Gotcha. Chris, what mistakes do you see people make? That's an extensive list. Well. Yeah, that's an extensive list.
Yeah.
Can you come up with something else?
Just to reiterate what Serpil said about recording, and the focus is so much on that recording that everything else doesn't seem to matter. And I've borrowed my daughter's ruler as a kind of a metaphor about, it's not mine, it's my daughter's, producing a podcast. A lot of people, I suppose when it comes to producing an episode or a podcast show, see that little round hinge in the middle? I would say that almost, in terms of a timeline, that almost represents the time it takes to record, press record and stop. All the rest of it is all the preparation involved before you get to this point. So you need to, if it's an interview style, you've got to research who you're going to interview. And I think a lot of podcasters, they just grab anyone. And you've got to understand, as an interviewee, it's difficult to be engaging. So it comes down to your questions. So if you don't know how engaging the interviewee is going to be, you have to draw that engagement out of them. And it comes from writing good questions. Now, often we will send the questions to the interviewee, so at least they're prepared in their mind what answer they're going to give. You never want them to read from a script at all. And if they ever come into the studio and do that, you throw the script away. And so it's got to be authentic. But there's all this preparation you need before the interview happens. And then the interviews, it doesn't have to be a 30-minute, 45-minute, 1 hour interview. You can have really decent podcasts that are 10 minutes long. It goes back to your goals, by the way. If you can achieve your business goals with a 10-minute podcast, do that. You don't need a 40-minute podcast. If you're talking about what does JobKeeper mean for business owners, you could get that information in 10 minutes, perhaps. And then after the interview, you've got to do all this work. You should be, as Serpil was saying, listen back through it, take out all that extraneous stuff, things that don't work, a Q&A that just is not engaging, and just make it tight. Make it, at the end of the day, it's a gift. A podcast is a gift for your audience. So you don't want to give them a gift that they don't want. So you edit it well, you clean it, you mix it, you get the levels correct, and then you put it together with music and perhaps a voiceover. And all of that work takes much longer than the actual interview itself. So that's the biggest mistake I think a lot of people who go into podcasting don't understand, is the time it takes, the resources to do it and to do it properly. And so that's why you get, 8 episodes limits. People are just sick of doing it. Really go in there and prepare everything.
Gotcha. That's a really good point. I want to mention that if anybody from the audience, you have a question of some of the things that we've discussed, please feel free to drop them in the comment section on the right, the chat section on the right hand side, and we'll have a look at them and we'll answer them. Unless there are actually a couple of them. Sorry. Let's actually have a look over here. So we have Rana. Indeed, I was about to ask, what is the strategy to start a podcast, and what is expecting to take it through the hard work? I think we talked about the strategy, Rana, but if we haven't addressed one of your questions, please let us know. Jules says, I'm really keen to hear how you can monetize a podcast. So talk about monetization. That's not something we talked about. Serpil, you wanna maybe shed some light on that?
So I guess the monetization side comes in terms of, I'm assuming they want to make money out of the podcast. that's an interesting question, because it comes down to download figures when you're an individual, when you're not a. Let me backtrack. So if you're a brand, the reason why you create a podcast is often because you either want to generate leads out of that podcast, you want to drive sales, you want to nurture existing customer relationships, or you want to position yourself as a thought leader. And when you're an individual, often you want to position yourself as a thought leader, right? And the way to monetize it, so if it comes down to download figures. So people often think that they're going to make money out of it because the Joe Rogans of the world are making $100 million deal out of it, right? And so I'm going to be a little bit harsh and go, if you're just starting out, don't expect to monetize, because it took Joe Rogan 11 years of podcasting and building an entire 30-year career prior to even launching into podcasting for him to get to that stage. And some people will never, ever get to that stage. There's only a handful of Joe Rogans. So for you to expect to monetize when you're just starting out, I think it's a unrealistic goal. Some of the figures that we know, for instance, is that when people release their podcasts in the first 30 days, the majority of podcasts won't get more than 125 listens. It still puts you in the sort of 50% of the podcast category. To get to the 1% of podcasts in the world, you need around 32,000 downloads.
In the first 30 days?
In the first 30 days of releasing your podcast. So unless you're a massive brand that's throwing a lot of marketing budget at this podcast, you're not going to get that level of interaction. So you're not going to be able to monetize, because monetizing comes down to download figures.
Gotcha. I think one of the other items to think about there is also the vertical that you're playing in and the niche that you're playing in. So if all of a sudden you're in a space that it's let's say you're in the IT space and you are talking about customer experience, like you mentioned, Chris, and you might not have a large audience, but that audience could be very valuable for a company, right? So if somebody is able to sell a customer experience piece of software that is worth, $100,000 for them, then that changes the game. If you're so think about the kind of niche that you're also playing, and that probably has a little bit of there's a little bit of leeway in terms of downloads. But thank you very much for that. So I know we got a couple more questions. Yeah, you want to mention something else?
I just wanted to quickly jump in, because it just occurred to me that if you do have, say, 1,000 downloads, you could approach a sponsor, because I did say that the ads are listened to. Like, we know 86% of people listen to the ads and take an action on the ads. So that could be a way to monetize it. So without sort of completely dismissing it and saying you're never going to make money out of it if you're an individual doing a podcast, but it all ties down to download figures. What are your download figures before you can even approach a sponsor? Gotcha.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. We got another question from Catherine. Ideas related to the podcast being the product. Catherine, if you could just clarify that. I think you mean, like, again, is it same as Jules in terms of like selling the podcast as a product itself to advertisers, or is there something else? Let me quickly scroll down here. Paula, what does the audience think about adding transcript to podcasts? This is a good question. This is probably goes to your point, Chris, when you mentioned, hey, there is stuff that you got to do afterwards. There's editing. You mentioned editing there. You mentioned, mixing and all that stuff. What are your thoughts, and either one of you, in terms of repurposing that podcast transcripts, turning it into blog, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I'll answer that indirectly. Short answer is don't bother necessarily. Depends on your audience. You're producing something for a particular medium, and that's audio. We've done transcripts, but a very small percentage want to read it because they've listened to it. But what you want to do is repurpose if you can, great idea is to repurpose your audio. I call it a baked pie concept. So you've done the interview. It's 20 minutes. You can cut some parts out and make it into a blog. So that could be providing it as a transcript, although you might want to just keep it shorter than the whole 20 minutes. You might want to get, say, the best minute and make it into a video. And there's online tools. I think Headliner is probably one of the most popular ones, where you can just use a static image behind it, and then the words they come up, and you can put that into Facebook or into Instagram or whatever. And you might want to use other bits and pieces for a newsletter. So it's worth exploring what you can do with the audio. I wouldn't necessarily just plonk the transcript and in the show notes necessarily. People do want to listen to a podcast because it's that particular medium. A simple transcription of it, if it's a 45-minute podcast, no one's really going to sit down and read 45 minutes of it. So that maybe a conflicting kind of answer there. Sorry.
No, and I want to get your input on this as well, Serpil. And the transcript is a tricky thing. 20-minute, 30-minute podcast could be what, 7,000, 8,000 words of in terms of transcription. But this kind of ties in really nicely with the next question that we have from Chris, which is no, I'm going to come back to you. Trust me on this, Serpil. So Chris talks about, and if I remember correctly, he's asking about how do I promote a podcast, and I want to come back to this very point because, Serpil, I know you work quite a lot on SEO, right? And I want to maybe curate that question a little bit in terms of, I've recorded the podcast, right? And I want to maybe repurpose that pieces, which is also going to help with promotion later on. How should I go and repurpose that? Obviously, transcript might be a little too clunky. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it definitely serves a purpose for two reasons. So you should, to drive your marketing dollar further, repurpose it into a blog or a feature article, like Chris said. So, and the other thing is that often we'll record longer. So, for instance, you might only hear 20 minutes or 15 minutes of the recording, but you may have actually recorded an hour interview to get that 15 minutes of podcast, because the audience doesn't need to hear the entirety of the hour interview. But what you can do is use that other information as supplementary information so that it's like a companion to the podcast. So you're not mirroring the exact information, you're also adding additional information as a supplementary add-on. So it's value adding to the audience, right? So that's two things that you can do. The transcript itself in its entirety is really important for SEO because Google's crawling our website, so it's crawling the words. So what you're doing is you're helping Google find the podcast. So that's really important for that. And the other thing that we need to consider is accessibility. I mean, we're able-bodied, but not everyone's able-bodied. So, you may have deaf people who want to partake in the, podcasting world. So the transcript then allows them to engage in the content that podcasts are creating. So it serves a purpose for accessibility. It serves a purpose for SEO. So it's a really valuable thing to consider.
So I have this question for you. I've recorded a podcast. Is it better for me to create a transcript of that podcast, or is it better and then put it over there from SEO perspective and from people viewing it, or it's better for me to take that podcast and turn it into a well thought out blog with, it's basically, it might be a summary, or it might be, you might add additional information. Is it better to do this or that, or should one do both of them? What are your thoughts on that?
I would do both. So if you're hosting the podcast on your website, have a transcript link available saying transcript available to download. But then in your blog pages, do a completely separate blog, because when you actually create your content marketing plan, you'll have a schedule of when you're releasing your blogs. So the blogs, not everyone listens to podcasts. So we know that about 25% of Australians listen to podcasts. So people who are reading blogs may read your blog, and at the end of it, you can actually say, to find out more about this, listen to our podcast. And there you're converting that person who has never listened to a podcast potentially to listen to a podcast. So it works as a cross-promotional tool as well. So never assume that everyone is consuming content in the same way, because we don't.
Gotcha. What other advice do you have? Maybe we'll go with, if you could answer this, Chris, for promotion. So the SEO component is one. What other ways do you see companies promoting their podcasts to get more downloads, to get more people listening to it?
Well, you got to be where your audience is. So wherever they are, and if you're got a particular demographic that are more inclined to be on Instagram, well, that's where you've got to be. And whether it's other social media, but you might also consider, if it's more geographical, if it's a regional city, you might have to advertise in their local paper, or get yourself out there on other people's podcasts. That's always a good way as well. That target your audience, you get on there and bring the audience to that podcast onto yours. So it's really you're limited by your imagination with how you promote it. There's so many. It's just a matter of knowing your audience, what they consume, what they watch, what they read, and getting into those channels.
Gotcha.
Yep.
No, sounds good. I mean, one of the things, you're right. Social media for us, for example, LinkedIn is big, where we create audiograms and we kind of push it out. We also ask our guests to, if they're open to sharing that with their audience and their following. There's another question from Sasha of examples of Australian corporate brands who are doing podcasts well. Serpil, what are your thoughts?
There's been a few. So Mercedes-Benz did Tough Conversations with Henry Rollins, which was quite well done. Medibank did a podcast. Telstra did a podcast. So there has been successful Australian brands that have actually jumped on the podcasting bandwagon, and they've been growing over the past few years. Yeah, and just sort of to add to the promotion thing as well, Shaheen, our process is a 3-step strategy. So it's owned, earned, and paid channels. So if you follow that method of promotion, so always start with your own channels, because people forget how many channels that they control themselves. So put your podcast in your own EDM, put it in front of your staff. If you're a big company, podcasts work really well from word of mouth. We know this. So if you're a company with 3,000 employees, you've got 3,000 ears there straight away. Get them to share it with their friends and their family. So look at what owned channels do I have before you go out to your earned channels, which is your social medias and outside outlets, before you even spend a dime on, advertising, which is the paid channels last. So that would be my advice.
Gotcha. That's a great advice. And I think, did you want to say something, Chris? Was that something you wanted to mention? Okay,
just agreeing. Yep.
I have more questions. There are tons of questions here. I love this. This is such an engaged audience. And I think what you mentioned, Serpil, to Sophie's point, is that, do you need to have an audience first, or, and then bring out a podcast, or you can grow it? I think you kind of answered that question, which is, really, if you have an audience, fantastic, you could leverage it, but you don't necessarily have to. And there's the other two components that you mentioned that you can leverage. Now, Alex, Mr. Hipwell, our own Mr. Hipwell, has a question, and he's like, when interviewing people remotely, any tips for improving the recording quality if the interviewee only has limited gears? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, we're all remote. We're all kind of quarantined. What are your thoughts on that?
Can I jump in? Have a decent microphone, USB microphone. This you can get some decent stuff for maybe $100 or $80. This is $250. It's a Rode NT USB. I love it. I've had it for quite a few years now. It just plugs straight into the USB port. Decent headphone set, $80 perhaps. Remote interviews, we've discovered the world's best kept secret. It's called Source Connect Now. So Source-Connect Now, Google that, and it gives you probably the best quality audio. The trick is you record your end and you get your guest to record their end and get them to send that audio to you by using wetransfer.com, wetransfer.com. It's free to use. Source Connect Now is free to use. And when you get the audio from their end, then you've got to go and match up the audio on a audio software. You can use GarageBand or Audacity. They're free. I use Hindenburg, which costs a bit of money, but it's good for podcasters. That way you maintain high audio quality. Ensure that your guest has a good microphone as well.
Gotcha. Throwing some tools out there. Okay, we got a lot more questions. Serpil, I want to cover some of the other questions. So let's see. So Rana said, I second Cliff, but do we really need to promote the podcast when we're already building a community for it? Kind of certain audience. Rana, you might need to clarify that a little bit more for me, and happy to address that. I'm not completely sure. Are you saying that, maybe don't promote the podcast because you have an audience? Or if you could clarify that a little bit, that would be great. Michael, what are your thoughts on a value for value model using PayPal or Patreon? I'm not sure about that question. Does that ring a bell with anyone?
I think what they're asking, if I've got this right, is so you can have a Patreon membership. So people actually pay you. It's like a sponsorship. So when you create a podcast, you can ask people to donate to get you to continue on with doing the podcast. So you might just say, can you donate $1, $1 a week to my Patreon account to get me. I think that's what they're asking.
Yeah, I think Tim Ferriss did that and didn't work, right?
Yeah. Yeah, like he decided to pull the pin on it. Yeah, so I think it's one of those things where if you don't test it and try it, you don't know, and you've got nothing to lose. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Sounds good. Thanks for that. Rebecca, can Google crawl through a PDF transcript file and use that for SEO? I think that's a no, but Serpil, I know your expertise is in SEO.
I'm not going to say yes or no to that because I'm not 100% sure and I don't want to mislead, but I can actually clarify offline and get back to them. Yeah. So
on that point, by the way, we jump on our Slack channel, growthcolony.org/Slack. The guests will definitely be there, and they can definitely clarify on that. There is a question about what's an audiogram. Jules, an audiogram is basically when you take a snippet of your podcast and put it in. If you've seen on LinkedIn, there's like those wiggly lines and wavelengths and all that stuff, and have a snippet of that. Now it's 11:59 and we have more questions, but I just don't think we're going to make it, guys. But please join our Slack channel. Our audience are going to be there. Before we wrap this up, Serpil, if people want to know more about you, what's the best way for them to find out?
So they can jump on writtenandrecorded.com, or they can connect with me on LinkedIn if they can manage to spell my name.
Sounds good. And Chris, what about yourself? What's the best way for people to connect with you and find out more?
Quickly, chrisashmore.me, and you'll find all the links to everywhere, including Twitter and everywhere, or LinkedIn. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to chat with you.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for jumping on. Really appreciate it. Make sure to go to our Slack channel. We are going to answer more questions later on the Slack channel. And on that note, that's a wrap for this webinar, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you very much for joining us, Serpil and Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shaheen.
Thanks, Shaheen.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.